Lauren Mitchell rarely received texts from her mother. So when her phone vibrated with a message that simply read, "Family meeting, 7 p.m., mandatory attendance," she immediately knew something was wrong. No greeting, no inquiry about her well-being, just a command. As if she were an employee in their company rather than their daughter. Lauren stood in front of the grand, imposing house she had grown up in, her hand hovering over the intricate brass doorbell. It should have felt familiar. But now it only felt foreign. This place, once filled with childhood memories, had become nothing more than a symbol of judgment and disappointment. Her eyes flickered to the sleek Mercedes parked in the driveway. A blatant reminder of what success meant in the Mitchell family. Ivy League degrees, prestigious careers, and seven-figure bank accounts. Anything less was considered failure. Lauren had chosen a different path, one they had never understood. Before she could press the doorbell, the door swung open abruptly. "You're late," her mother said, her lips so tightly pressed together that it seemed any loosening would unleash a flood of reprimands. Lauren glanced at her watch. 6:58 p.m. She let out a quiet laugh. Since when does "on time" mean late? Her mother didn't respond. Instead, she turned sharply and walked back into the house, expecting Lauren to follow. Lauren hesitated for a moment. She knew what awaited her inside. This wasn't a gathering for love or reconciliation. It was a tribunal. Taking a slow breath, she stepped in. The living room was as immaculate as ever. The expensive decor arranged with the same cold perfection that mirrored her family's values, appearance over authenticity, status over sentiment. Her presence barely registered. No one stood to greet her. No hugs, no warmth, just silence. Rebecca, her eldest sister, sat upright on the couch, a leather briefcase resting neatly beside her, like she was preparing to argue a case in court. Daniel, the youngest, remained glued to his phone, barely acknowledging Lauren's existence. Lucas, her older brother, was still in his doctor's scrubs, arms crossed over his chest, his sharp gaze filled with thinly veiled disapproval. Near the fireplace, her father stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable but rigid, like a judge about to deliver a sentence. And in the center of the room, a single chair had been placed, facing them all. Lauren understood the message immediately. She was not a member of this family tonight. She was a defendant standing before a jury. Slowly, she took her seat, keeping her back straight, her expression neutral. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's hear it. What is this really about?" Rebecca was the first to speak. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Her movements precise, impersonal. She didn't look at Lauren as a sister, but as a problem to be solved. "We've discussed the future of the family's public image," Rebecca began, her tone cold and professional. "And we've come to a necessary decision." Their mother, sitting close to Lucas as if seeking silent validation, added, "It's about protecting the Mitchell legacy. This is in the family's best interest." Lauren took the documents, her eyes scanning the legal jargon carefully crafted to sound clinical, almost businesslike. She didn't need to read every line to understand the core message. Termination of family relations, forfeiture of inheritance rights, severance of all financial ties. The final nail in the coffin. A dry, bitter laugh escaped her lips. "So this is it? You're officially cutting me off?" "This isn't personal," Daniel finally spoke, still not looking up from his phone. "It's just business." Lauren arched an eyebrow. "Business? I'm your sister. How is this not personal?" Her father exhaled deeply, shaking his head. "Lauren, your lifestyle reflects poorly on this family. That so-called business of yours is a business," she interjected, her voice sharp. Lucas scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "It's a joke." His condescending smirk was the same one he had always worn when talking about her work. "Everyone at the hospital knows I have a sister who makes eco-friendly crafts," he said, making air quotes. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is?" Lauren's grip tightened on the documents. She was used to their judgment, the sighs of disappointment, the disapproving glances at family gatherings. But this was different. Her mother's voice softened, though the condescension remained. "We gave you every opportunity, the best schools, the best connections. We supported you in every way. And you threw it all away for this? Lauren inhaled deeply, willing herself to remain calm. Where do I sign? A flicker of surprise crossed her mother's face. She had expected anger, maybe even pleading, but not indifference. Lauren, if you reconsider, I asked where I sign. Rebecca hesitated, then flipped to the last page and pointed to the bottom. Lauren picked up the pen, her hand steady. 10 minutes later, it was done. She set the pen down, and a strange lightness filled her chest. Not sadness, not regret, something else. Relief. Her father spoke as she stood. I hope you understand, Lauren. This is what's best for the family. She turned toward the door, pausing for just a moment to look at them one last time. You've always been afraid that I would ruin the Mitchell name, she said softly, but not one of you ever actually knew what I built, or what I will become. Her mother opened her mouth to reply, but Lauren held up a hand. You made this choice, now live with it. With that, she walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. Too softly for the weight of what had just happened. The night air was cool against her skin as she stepped into the driveway. Taking in the moment, she was sad, but she wouldn't say it out loud. Sliding into the driver's seat of her car, she wiped away a single tear before gripping the wheel, her hands trembling slightly. The family she had fought so hard to belong to had just abandoned her. But they had underestimated her. She would show them. She would prove them wrong. 3 days had passed since Lauren Mitchell walked away from her family for the last time. She had barely slept, not because she regretted her decision, but because anger and determination had settled into her bones. The rejection wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was a lifetime of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated like an outsider in her own family. Lauren had built something for herself. Something real, something she was proud of. And yet, in their eyes, it was nothing. Well, she would show them. The rhythmic sound of rain tapping against the windows of her workshop was the only noise filling the space. The air smelled of sawdust, varnish, and the faint hint of coffee that her best friend and business partner, Lena Carter, had just set beside her. Lena crossed her arms, watching Lauren stir a clear, glossy resin in a small container. They really did that to you? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Lauren didn't look up. Not only did they disown me, they made sure I had no financial ties left with them. Lena scoffed. And you just signed without a fight? Lauren let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the mixing stick. What was there to fight for? If they were so eager to erase me, why should I cling to them? Lena shook her head, frustration evident on her face. But before she could say anything else, the workshop door burst open. Ethan Clark, their business partner and marketing strategist, stormed in, his laptop clutched tightly in his arms. His expression was a mix of excitement and urgency. Lauren, you need to see this. Now. Lauren blinked, setting her tools aside. Another order issue? No. Ethan placed the laptop in front of her and spun the screen toward her. A huge opportunity. On the homepage of Living and Style, a major interior design publication. A bold headline blazed across the screen. The young artist transforming sustainable interior design. Meet Lauren Mitchell. Lauren froze. Her name, her work, front and center. She leaned in, scanning the article. It praised her craftsmanship, her dedication to using reclaimed materials, and hailed her as a pioneer in the sustainable interior design movement. She swallowed. Did they just call me an artist? Lena practically screamed. Not just that, they're recognizing you as a leader in the industry. Ethan tapped his fingers against the wooden table. And that's not all. Do you know who shared this article? Lauren shook her head. Business Forward. Her breath hitched. Business Forward, one of the top business magazines in the country. Ethan grinned. And they want you on the cover of their next issue. For a moment, Lauren couldn't speak. She had always believed in her work, but she had never imagined it would gain this level of recognition. She looked at Ethan, then at Lena, then back at the screen. Her heart pounded. Lena nudged her. Are you going to do it? Lauren exhaled slowly, then nodded. Of course. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The Business Forward article spread like wildfire. Within a month, the revenue for Lauren's workshop skyrocketed 50-fold. Orders poured in from across the country, even internationally. boutique stores, high-end luxury brands, even well-known architecture firms reached out, wanting exclusive collaborations. Her inbox was flooded with invitations, industry panels, design showcases, media interviews, and then came the biggest offer yet, a prestigious recycled furniture chain wanting to create a signature collection with her. Lauren's small business had transformed overnight. She was constantly meeting clients, signing contracts, expanding operations. She had built something real. She had built an empire. And then, one morning, her phone started buzzing with names she never expected to see. "Dad." Lauren stared at the screen. His message was short. "Call me." She didn't. A moment later, another notification popped up. "Rebecca, we need to talk. Call me when you have time." Lauren scoffed. "When they signed the papers to cut me off, did they ever think this day would come?" Another message. "Lucas, I read the article. Congratulations. Mom and Dad want to see you." Lauren leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a humorless smile. Oh, now they wanted to talk. She didn't reply to any of them. Instead, she checked her schedule. Tomorrow morning, she had a cover shoot for Business Forward. After that, she had a meeting with a major TV producer who wanted to feature her journey on the Today Show. Her family could wait, because this time, she was the one in control. Lauren hadn't spoken to her family in nearly a year. And yet, here she was, staring at a text message from her father. A name that had once meant authority and control, but now felt as distant as a stranger's. "Dinner at home. Sunday. 7 p.m. The whole family will be there. We need to talk. Sweetheart. Sweetheart." Lauren let out a sharp laugh. A bitter, humorless sound. She could count on one hand the number of times her father had used that word in the past decade. He had always been formal, distant, treating her like a business liability rather than a daughter. But now that she was someone important, now she was, "Sweetheart," again? She set her phone down, exhaling slowly. She should ignore them. She should block their numbers like she had months ago. Walk away like they had walked away from her. But something inside her, some old part of her that still craved an explanation, made her type a single reply. "Okay." She arrived exactly at 7 p.m. Not early, not late. The house looked exactly the same, pristine. Perfect. A symbol of everything they valued. A house built on status. On expectations. On a legacy that had never included her. Her mother opened the door before Lauren could even knock. Her eyes were slightly puffy, as if she had been crying. But her voice remained composed. Calculated. "Lauren, you're here." The words felt strange, awkward, not quite an invitation, not quite an apology. Lauren didn't respond. She simply walked inside. The living room was eerily silent. They were all there. Rebecca, poised and unreadable. Lucas, arms crossed, his doctor's scrubs still on, as if he had more important places to be. Daniel, distracted, scrolling through his phone. And her father. He stood near the fireplace, just as he had the night they disowned her. But this time, there was no arrogance, no condescension, only quiet calculation. Lauren took a seat, but this time, she didn't feel like the outsider. This time, she was the one in control. "Why am I here?" she asked, crossing her arms. A beat of silence. Then Rebecca cleared her throat. "My company is in trouble." Lauren raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "The car company?" Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "We're having issues with our loans. The auto industry is changing. And we're falling behind." Lauren's lips twitched. "Falling behind?" she repeated. "That's interesting. I remember you saying something about my cheap craft business being a joke. And yet, here we are." Her father exhaled sharply. "Lauren, we need your help." There it was. The reason they had called her back. Not because they missed her. Not because they had realized their mistake. Because they needed her. Her mother leaned forward, her voice softer. "Your image, your reputation, it could save us." Lauren laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, my reputation?" she said, tilting her head. "You mean the same reputation you called shameful a year ago? The one that damaged the family name?" No one spoke. She set her glass down with a quiet clink and folded her arms. "You don't want me. You want what I can bring you." Rebecca sighed, pulling out a folder from her briefcase. "Lauren, we're all adults. This is business. Lauren shook her head. No, it's not. It's survival. Her father clenched his jaw. You don't have to do this. Lauren met his gaze. Do what, Dad? She said, voice steady. Live by my values? Stand by what I believe in. You always told me never to let anyone take advantage of me. Congratulations, I finally listened. The air in the room grew heavy. A waiter stepped in from the adjoining kitchen, placing plates of untouched food on the dining table. No one moved. Her mother placed her hands on the table, desperation creeping into her voice. You're the only one who can help us. Lauren stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, she stood up. I used to value family, she said quietly. Back then, if you had simply supported me, I wouldn't hesitate to help you now. But you made one thing very clear. I'm not part of this family anymore. Because my career, my lowly job, was a disgrace to you. She picked up her bag and turned to leave. Her father's voice cut through the silence. Lauren. She paused. Name your price, he said. Whatever it is, we can negotiate. Lauren turned back, meeting his gaze with an almost amused expression. You're mistaken, Dad, she said, tilting her head. My price isn't money, it's trust, and you can't afford it anymore. You threw it away a year ago. Then, without another word, she walked out. She didn't feel anger, or sadness, or regret. She felt free. 3 months ago, they had pushed her out of their lives. And now, as their world crumbled around them, they wanted her back. She said no, and she didn't regret it. Lauren had expected her family to come crawling back, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Not even a week after she walked out on their desperate dinner invitation. The messages started flooding in. First from Rebecca, then from Lucas, then from her father. Rebecca's was formal, calculated. We need to talk. It's urgent. Call me as soon as possible. Lucas's was less polished but just as predictable. Mom and Dad want to see you. They said it's a family matter. A family matter. The irony nearly made her laugh. The same family that had erased her existence. The same family that had signed legal documents severing all ties, was now trying to remind her that she was still one of them. She put her phone down and went back to work. But an hour later, another message appeared. This time, it was from her father. Dinner at home, Sunday, 7 p.m. The whole family will be there. We need to talk, sweetheart. There it was again, that word, sweetheart. Lauren leaned back in her chair, staring at the message, weighing her options. She didn't owe them anything. They had made their choice a year ago. And yet, this was different. This time, she was in control, so she typed a short reply. Okay. She didn't arrive early. She made sure to show up exactly at 7 p.m. this time, not a minute before. Not a second after. When she stepped onto the front porch, she noticed something immediately. Nothing had changed. The same Mercedes parked in the driveway. The same pristine hedges. The same spotless white paint. As if everything inside this house hadn't already started crumbling. Her mother opened the door before she could knock. Her eyes were slightly puffy, as if she had been crying. But her voice remained composed. Lauren, you're here. It sounded more like a statement than a welcome. Lauren didn't reply. She just walked inside. The living room was eerily silent. They were all there. Rebecca, poised and unreadable. Lucas, arms crossed, his expression tense. Daniel, hunched over his phone, feigning disinterest. And her father, standing near the fireplace. Lauren took a seat at the table. But this time, she wasn't the outsider. This time, she was the one with the upper hand. She folded her arms, her gaze steady. Why am I here? Rebecca was the first to speak. The company is in trouble. Lauren exhaled slowly, feigning surprise. Oh? Lucas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The auto industry is changing. We're falling behind. Lauren let out a quiet laugh. Falling behind? That's interesting. I remember you saying something about my cheap craft business being a joke. And yet, here we are. Her father sighed, rubbing his temple. Lauren, we need your help. There it was. The reason they had called her back. Not because they missed her. Not because they had finally realized their mistake. Because they needed her. Her mother's voice softened. Your reputation, your connections, they could save us. Lauren tilted her head. Oh, my reputation? You mean the same reputation that you called embarrassing? The one that damaged the family name? Silence. She leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping against the table. You don't want me, she said finally. You want what I can bring you. Rebecca sighed, reaching for a folder. Lauren, we're all adults. This is business. Lauren shook her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. No, it's not. It's desperation. Her father clenched his jaw. You don't have to do this. Lauren arched an eyebrow. Do what? Live by my values? Stand by what I believe in? You always told me never to let anyone take advantage of me. Well, congratulations, I finally listened. A thick, heavy silence settled over the room. Then her father exhaled sharply. Name your price. Lauren's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Oh, no, Dad, you don't get to dictate the terms this time. I do. She pulled out a stack of documents from her bag and placed them on the table. Rebecca frowned. What's this? Lauren tapped the top page. If I help you, these are my conditions. Her father picked up the papers, his expression unreadable. Sinclair Auto will cease to exist. Lauren's voice was calm, steady. It will be rebranded as Sinclair Electric, a sustainable electric car brand that incorporates recycled materials into its designs. Lucas frowned. Wait, you want to change the entire company? Lauren met his gaze. The world is changing, Lucas, and you were too slow to adapt. If this company wants to survive, it has to become something entirely new. And I'm the one who will make that happen. Rebecca skimmed through the contract, her lips pressing into a thin line. And you want full control? Lauren nodded. I will be CEO. I will hold 51% ownership and have full executive control. None of you will have the authority to interfere. Her father set the papers down. That's a bold demand. Lauren smiled. Not a demand, a requirement. A long silence stretched across the table. Finally, Rebecca sighed. And if we agree? Lauren leaned forward, her voice unwavering. Then we move forward. But there's one last condition. She looked at each of them, her gaze sharp. The past ends here. No one gets to call me the disgraceful child or the family betrayer anymore. If you want my help, then you acknowledge that I was never the problem, you were. More silence. Her mother's eyes welled with fresh tears. Lucas looked away. Rebecca folded her hands, exhaling slowly. You're right, she admitted. We were wrong. Daniel nodded slightly, no longer wearing his usual indifference. Finally, her father reached for the contract. Hand me the pen. Lauren studied him for a moment, then passed him the pen. And one by one, they signed the agreement they never thought they'd have to make. At that moment, Lauren knew she had truly won. The ink had barely dried on the contract. Yet Lauren knew it would take more than a few signatures to truly change the dynamic of the Sinclair family. Paper meant nothing if the people behind it didn't truly believe in the change they were committing to. The first real test came just 2 weeks after she took over as CEO. The Sinclair Electric rebrand was already making waves. Industry analysts were intrigued, sustainability experts were watching closely, and investors, who had once dismissed the Sinclair family as relics of the past, were suddenly interested again. But there was one problem. Her family still struggled to see her as their leader. It was in a high-stakes meeting with a group of investors that Lauren saw the cracks in their so-called agreement. The Sinclair boardroom was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and polished mahogany. The city skyline glowed behind floor-to-ceiling windows, the perfect backdrop for what should have been a triumphant moment. Lauren stood at the head of the table, presenting the new strategy, the pivot to electric, the integration of sustainable materials, and the partnership with cutting-edge battery manufacturers. The investors listened intently. They asked smart questions. They saw the vision. But when it was time to wrap up, Lucas spoke out of turn. As you all know, he said smoothly, his tone far too confident for someone who no longer had decision-making power. Sinclair Electric is a family-run business. Our team has always been led by strong leadership. And while Lauren is heading the transition, our legacy will remain intact. Lauren's jaw clenched. He was undermining her, right in front of the investors. She set down her pen, deliberately, making sure the room noticed. Lucas, I'm sorry. Who is our leadership? Lucas hesitated. I just meant, no, Lauren cut in, her voice steady but sharp. Say what you meant. The room fell into silence. The investors were watching. The executives were watching. Lucas cleared his throat. I meant that this is still a team effort. And we all play a role in. Lucas, Lauren said, tilting her head. Do you have decision-making power at Sinclair Electric? The tension in the room thickened. Lucas's mouth opened, then closed. He knew the answer. Everyone did. No, he admitted. Then let me make something clear. Lauren straightened, her voice unwavering. This is not a team effort. This is my company. You may be a part of it, but I lead it, so the next time you try to soften my authority in front of investors, remember that. A flicker of something crossed Lucas's face. Embarrassment? Resentment? Or perhaps, realization. The investors exchanged looks, but none of them seemed concerned. If anything, they looked impressed. After the meeting, Rebecca caught up with her in the hallway. You didn't have to humiliate him, she said, arms crossed. Lauren let out a short laugh. I didn't humiliate him. I corrected him. Rebecca sighed, rubbing her temple. It's hard for him. You know. I don't care. Lauren replied bluntly. He had no problem watching me struggle when you all threw me out. He had no problem calling my career a joke. If it's hard for him to accept that I'm in charge now, that's his problem, not mine. Rebecca was silent for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. 3 months later, the final test came. Lauren had been invited to speak at a major sustainability summit in New York. It was the kind of event that could permanently cement Sinclair Electric as a leader in the industry. She was set to take the stage in 20 minutes when her father walked into the dressing room. She tensed. He hadn't attended any of her events before. In fact, he had largely stayed in the background since signing the contract. She assumed it was pride, or perhaps regret. He sat down across from her, clearing his throat. You know, I never expected you to actually pull this off. Lauren raised an eyebrow. You mean running a company? Or proving you wrong? His lips twitched, almost as if he wanted to smile. Both. Lauren watched him carefully. He looked older now, not just because of age, but because for the first time, he wasn't carrying the company. She expected him to launch into a speech about how difficult it had been for him to hand over control, about how he still struggled to see her in this role. But instead, he said something she never expected. I'm proud of you. Lauren blinked, taken aback. Her father continued, his voice quieter now. You were always the one who had the courage to do what the rest of us couldn't. I see that now. She could have brushed it off. She could have told him it was too late for sentimentality. But instead, she let the words settle. She had spent her entire life fighting for his approval. And now, for the first time, she realized, she didn't need it. His pride in her? It was a bonus, not a necessity. She stood up, adjusting the microphone on her blazer. I have to go. Her father nodded, standing up as well. I'll be watching. As she stepped onto the stage, the applause was deafening. Journalists, business leaders, industry pioneers, they were all there to hear what she had to say. She walked up to the podium, took a deep breath, and smiled. For the first time, she wasn't just the outcast of the Sinclair family. She was Lauren Sinclair, CEO of the most revolutionary electric vehicle company in the country. And this time, her family had no choice but to acknowledge it. Lauren stood in the heart of her art studio, the very place where she had first found solace in creativity, where she had begun to forge a life separate from her family's rigid expectations. But tonight, this space held a different significance. Before her was a small metal fire pit, and inside it sat a stack of papers, the remnants of the past she was finally ready to leave behind. Among them was the disownment contract, the very document that had once severed her from her family, the paper that had represented their rejection and her greatest heartbreak. Her family stood behind her now, watching in silence. They had once cast her out, and now they were here, waiting for her decision. Lauren held the match between her fingers, contemplating for a brief moment. She thought about the years she had spent struggling for their approval. The pain of knowing she had never been enough for them until she became someone they needed. That girl no longer existed. With a flick of her wrist, she struck the match against the rough edge of the matchbox. The flame sprang to life, flickering in the dimly lit studio. casting long shadows on the walls. This was it. She dropped the match onto the papers. At first, the flames licked at the edges, hesitant, as if mirroring the final remnants of doubt that clung to her. Then, all at once, the fire consumed the documents, curling the paper into blackened ash. The contract, the old business agreements, every legal record of their rejection, burned away. The weight on her chest lifted. This was not just a symbolic act. This was freedom. Lucas, who had once dismissed her work as childish, now stood beside her, watching the flames dance. He exhaled slowly. "It's really over," he murmured. Rebecca, always composed, let out a quiet sigh. It had to be done. Their father, the man who had once been the pillar of the Sinclair family, stepped forward. He looked at the fire, then at Lauren, something unspoken in his expression. Pride? Regret? Acceptance? Maybe all three. "You burned the past," he said after a long silence. "What happens now?" Lauren turned to face them fully. "Now, we build something better." 1 year later, Sinclair Electric had done more than survive, it had thrived. Under Lauren's leadership, the company had become a leader in sustainable transportation, pioneering electric vehicle designs that were both technologically advanced and artistically inspired. The grand opening of their latest showroom was nothing short of spectacular. The space was an architectural masterpiece, sleek, modern, and seamlessly integrated with recycled materials. Handcrafted sculptures made from repurposed metals lined the showroom, merging art with innovation. It wasn't just a car dealership, it was an experience, a symbol of reinvention. As Lauren stepped onto the small stage to address the audience, she scanned the room. Investors, industry leaders, journalists, all the people who had once doubted her, were now here to celebrate her success. But more importantly, her family stood in the front row, no longer just spectators, but true partners. She took a deep breath, letting the moment settle before speaking. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady, "this company was on the brink of collapse. People said it couldn't be saved, that it was too old, too outdated, too stubborn to evolve." She paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. But evolution is inevitable, change is inevitable, and those who refuse to adapt get left behind. She saw her father nod slightly, a silent acknowledgement of his own mistakes. Lauren continued, "What we've built here is more than just a company. It's a statement. It's proof that reinvention is possible, not just for businesses, but for people, for families." A round of applause broke out. But she wasn't done. "I want to thank those who stood by me when no one else did," she said, her gaze flickering toward Ethan and Lena, her closest friends and the people who had believed in her long before her family did. "And I want to acknowledge those who doubted me, because without that doubt, I might not have fought so hard to prove them wrong." There were a few quiet chuckles from the audience. But her family knew the truth behind those words. She had won, not through vengeance, but through relentless perseverance. As the event wrapped up and the celebration began, Rebecca approached her, a glass of wine in hand. "You know," she said, "you could have held onto that grudge forever. You had every right to." Lauren took a sip of her own drink, then smiled. "Holding onto anger would have kept me stuck in the past. And I've got bigger things ahead." Rebecca nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. "You really did it, didn't you?" Lauren glanced around the showroom, at the electric vehicles that now represented a new era for the Sinclair name, at the people who had once dismissed her now looking at her with admiration. "Yeah," she said, "I really did." As the night wound down, Lauren found herself standing in front of the sculpture she had created, the one forged from the ashes of the disownment papers. It stood tall in the center of the showroom, illuminated by soft, golden lights, a reminder that even the most broken things could be reshaped into something stronger. Her father stepped beside her, his gaze fixed on the sculpture. "I was wrong about you," he admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. "I thought you had to fit into our world. I never realized you were meant to build your own." Lauren let his words settle. For years, she had craved those exact words. Now, she realized she didn't need them to move forward, but she appreciated them all the same. She turned to him, a small but genuine smile on her lips. "It's not about being right or wrong," she said, It's about finally seeing things clearly. He nodded, looking at her with something she had waited her whole life to see: respect. And as she stood there, surrounded by the empire she had built with her own hands, Lauren knew one thing for certain. She had not only rewritten her family's legacy, she had forged her own. Lauren's journey is more than just a story of success. It is a powerful testament to self-worth, resilience, and the courage to walk away from what no longer serves you. She was cast aside by her own family, deemed unworthy until she became someone they needed. But instead of breaking under their rejection, she built something greater than they had ever imagined. Her story teaches us that true value is not measured by others' approval but by our own belief in ourselves. Sometimes, the best way to prove your worth is not through vengeance, but through undeniable achievement. Revenge is temporary, but success is permanent. It also reminds us that forgiveness is a choice, not an obligation. Lauren chose to help her family on her terms, not out of guilt, but because she had already won. She held the power, not them, and that is the ultimate victory. What would you have done in Lauren's position? Would you have forgiven them or walked away for good? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you love stories of empowerment, redemption, and dramatic turnarounds, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more inspiring content.